All right. Well, let's jump in this morning. We're in 1 Peter chapter 2. And, yesterday as we looked at the first 3 verses of chapter 2, which they flow, again, chapter 2 flows from the end of chapter 1. So at the end in 1 Peter 1, in the I'm just reading kind of the adjusted verses, where we've kind of shown with our translation. But in verse 22, it said, "Your souls have been purified in the obedience of the truth into brotherly love." That's not an act, right? It's not hypocritical. It's not pretense. "From a cleansed heart, from a purified heart, love one another fully stretched out. You've been born again, not from seed that's corruptible, mortal, but from that which is not corruptible, through the living, enduring Word of God." Then move into chapter 2. We'll skip ahead after he quotes from Isaiah chapter 40. And he says, "Take off, like as a garment, get rid of, therefore, all evil, all falseness, all pretense, hypocrisy, play acting." Get rid of stop playing the games. Get rid of envy, where you're desiring that which, instead of rejoicing with those who rejoice, it's an ill will toward them, wanting what they have rather than being joyful for them, and all destructive talking. Verse 2, "Like newborn babies, let the spiritual unpolluted milk be your craving." And that word for spiritual is logikon, which is again, it has to do with spiritual, and it's rooted in the Word, "so that you may grow by drinking it into salvation." So by drinking it, you're going to grow into the fullness of what God is making you, since you've gotten a taste of the goodness of the Lord. And, there's a passage in Ephesians 4 that really beautifully summarizes, so much of what Peter is expressing here, where in Ephesians 4:13, Paul writes, "This will continue until we come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature adulthood, to the measure of the stature of Messiah's fullness." We're growing up into his likeness, to be formed into his likeness, so that we're reflecting his character. Get rid of all the deceit, all the falseness, all the junk that is not of him, and be craving the pure spiritual milk, so that we can grow up into his likeness. Verse 14, "As a result, we're no longer to be like children, tossed around by the waves and known all over by every wind of teaching, by the trickery of men with cunning and deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love." So you have truth and love always together. We are to grow up in all ways into Messiah, who is the head, right? So that's a kind of a summary of what we've been looking at here. In 1 Peter 2 says, hey, you've tasted the goodness of the Lord, so crave what is purely from him. You've tasted it, so don't lose the taste of that. Crave what comes from him. And he's referring to, when he refers to taste, you've tasted the goodness of the Lord, there's reference to Psalm 34. Psalm 34:9 saying, "Taste and see how good Adonai is. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him." And as we flow into verse 4 is rooted now in that idea around that you get in Isaiah 34. In Isaiah 34:5 and 6, it said, "I sought Adonai, and he answered me, and he delivered me from all my fears. Those who looked to him were radiant." And in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, it translated as those who came to him, come to him and be radiant. It can mean come to him and be radiant, and your faces will never be ashamed. And so this picture from Psalm 34 is in his taste and see that the Lord is good. Come to him and be radiant. So now we come to verse 4, and it says, to him you come. To him you're coming. And the metaphor shifts from talking about as newborn babies, that as you're craving this milk which is building you up. The picture of being built up naturally shifts into the construction into the building up of something, into, as the Lord begins to talk about the house that we are being constructed into. In Hebrew thought, to be built into a house had everything to do with offspring and children. It was not about a physical construction. It was about a family, about a house, to be built into a house. And so he says in verse 4, as you come to him, I'll read in the TLV and then as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but chosen by God and precious. And it says, to him you have come, a living stone. Under men, on the one hand, he's declared useless. But on the other hand, from God, he's chosen and honored. He's valued. And so here Yeshua is spoken of as lithon zonta, the living stone. And so what you got here really pictured for us are two different building projects by two different builders, right? You have a project that's being built by men, and you have a project that's being built by God. And so the men, Yeshua didn't fit into the paradigm of what humanity is building, of the kingdom of this world, right? On the one hand, he is declared useless, it says, rejected. And the term rejected implies that the builders have examined it and then cast it aside as a reject. They've looked it over. Like when I go to Home Depot and I'm getting wood, and if the wood is not straight and true, I set it aside. And you'll see, you never take from the top because everybody's already looked at the top and said, nah, that's bent, that's twisted, I don't want that. So this would be a stone. Which stone can we use to build what we're building? And they look at it and they go, nah, this doesn't qualify. This isn't good enough. And they've cast it aside. And then you have the picture on the other hand of what they've cast aside is the Lord going, this is exactly what I need. You know, the phrase, one man's trash is another man's treasure. Except what God is building, God uses, right? I mean, in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about, think of what you were. Think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise. Not many of you were a big deal. But God chose the weak things of the world, the foolish things of this world. So Yeshua, and everything he represented was rejected by humanity because he didn't look like what they thought they needed for the kingdom that they were building. His ways, his methods, it didn't fit into their paradigm. Even when you think about him as their picture of what Messiah should do and how he should look and how he should win, that he wins by conquering, he wins by taking power, he wins by crushing. That's what they wanted. They wanted to crush and to impose rule. And he wins by laying his life down. So here you've got Yeshua, the living stone. To him you come, the living stone, rejected by men. But by God, but with God he's chosen. With God he's selected and valued and seen as precious. And so this is something that the readers are really, they'll need to identify with. They do identify with. They feel rejected. They're rejected on every level, tossed aside on every level, and rejected to the point where it can be tempting to compromise in order to stop feeling rejected. It can be tempting to go, you know what, they're rejected by society, by the government, they're rejected by the Jewish unbelievers that are brothers and sisters and family members. They're rejected by the natives in the land to which they've been exiled. They're alone and persecuted, and they've lost so much. And so Peter is saying he is the living stone, and he begins to talk about him being the chief cornerstone. And this is the kind of thing, Peter's preaching. And Peter is preaching what has been taught to him by Yeshua himself. I mean, in Acts chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, Peter's talking to the religious leaders, you'll remember. He and John had healed the lame man in the name of Messiah Yeshua of Nazareth. We don't have silver and gold, but what we have we give you. Right? Rise up and walk. And so these people say, hey, by what power do you do things? Under whose name, under whose authority do you do these things? Stop preaching in this name. By whose authority do you preach these things? In that moment, when Peter goes to stand up, he recalled that there was a time that people asked Yeshua, by whose authority do you do these things? By whose authority do you do these things? Back in Mark chapter 12 and in Matthew 21 and in Luke 20, Yeshua is asked, by whose authority do you do these things? And Yeshua answers, tells the parable of the vineyard, the parable of the master who sent person after person, prophet after prophet, and to his vineyard. And within that, Yeshua ends up saying, quoting this passage from Isaiah. I'm sorry. Well, we're going to look at the passage that he's quoting. The passage that Peter is quoting here or referring to is from Isaiah 28. We'll look at it in a second. But in Acts 4, Peter says, this Yeshua, the one you ask by whose authority we do this Yeshua is the stone rejected by you, the builders, that has become the chief cornerstone. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. In Matthew 21, Yeshua had been asked again, by whose authority you do these things, and he tells the story of the vineyard. Right before he tells that story, he says this in Matthew 21, verses 31 and 32. He says, truly I tell you, the tax collectors and prostitutes are going ahead of you into the kingdom of God. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you didn't believe him. But the tax collectors and prostitutes did believe him. And even after you saw this, you had no change of heart to believe him. So what Yeshua even refers to here are the things that are the ones that are thrown away. A lot of times people use passages like what we're even reading here in 1 Peter to preach what is often called replacement theology. That God is done with Israel as a whole, that he's thrown Israel away and he's done with them, and no purpose is for Israel, and he's replaced them with the church, with an idea that it's just the Gentile church. But what you see even in Yeshua's teaching, the passages that are twisted, when he's talking about these tax collectors and these prostitutes, these are people who are Jewish, right? They're Israelis. They're living in the land, but they're broken. They're not religious elite. They're not stuck into patterns of tradition. They're in a place where they're actually in a humble place to see Yeshua. And when they experience the mercy of God, when they experience the love of God and the healing of God, to see who he is and to respond. And often the religious aren't able to, those who are locked into their expertise, locked into their ways. They think they know so much. And Yeshua says to the religious, those that you think are good for nothing, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, those that you've thrown aside, they're heading into the kingdom ahead of you. And even in our day, I want to say that we need to be careful that we don't throw off as unfit for the kingdom those which the religious elite will deem as unfit. The Lord didn't leave tax collectors collecting taxes and ripping people off. He didn't leave prostitutes prostituting. But he did take them from where they were. And so you have this picture. He is a living stone who was rejected. And now these that are rejected, he is taking. He is the cornerstone. He is the cornerstone of something, and we'll see that the Lord is building, of rejected stones, of those that are thrown away. But it's God is building something that it looks very different from what humanity desires to build, from the kingdoms of this world. It looks very different, but what is rejected by the human builders is picked up by the Lord, just as with it is, just as he says here with Yeshua, it is precious and valued, and he has a perfect place to fit it. You know, we've been rejected, thrown away, we've lost everything, born into a living hope, undying, untainted, and unfading inheritance. We've been born anew, not of perishable seed, but imperishable, through the living word, the living and enduring word of God. And so now verse 5 connects us to him. It says, and you, as living stones, you also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house. So you, like living stones, so you too, you're also like living stones. You're being built up into, or as a house, pneumatikas, a spiritual house, not a physical building. You're being built up as a spiritual house into a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Messiah Yeshua. And the word to offer up there has to do with, what do priests do? They sacrifice. And sacrificing had to do with literally slaughtering animals. There was death. There was death on the altar. So what you're laying on the altar is there's a dying, there's a death, there's a slaughtering that is happening, but these are sacrifices that are spiritual sacrifices. It doesn't mean they're less painful. It doesn't mean something's not dying, right? But usually it's something, I'm dying to self, I'm offering up spiritual sacrifices. Again, we mentioned it yesterday, Romans 12:1 uses this word spiritual logikon, the word at the root, says, I urge you therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, your living stones, right? A holy priesthood, as living sacrifices, holy, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship or service. That this is a sacrifice that is painful. So we're like living stones. We're being built up into a spiritual house. And so, again, you get the connections where in chapter 1, we're told at the beginning, look, you're where you don't want to be. You're in a painful place, rejected, but you're chosen by God. And God knew you would be here in the early verses of chapter 1. And then later down in verse 20, he says, speaking of Yeshua, says he was chosen in advance. He was known before the foundation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. So you're chosen and known. Like he was chosen and known. He is a living stone, and you are a living stone, and he's the chief stone. You are being built into a spiritual house. This isn't about a building. If Peter meant to refer to a religious building, he would have used other words. There are other words, naos, or hieron, but he's using the word house, oikon, right? It's a house. It's a holy people. He's building you up into a house, a spiritual house, which speaks to a family, which speaks to a people, which speaks to offspring. And you're being formed into a holy priesthood, offering up spiritual sacrifices, spiritual offerings that are dying. So you've got now the believers being portrayed as a temple, but it's not a literal stone building, right? The temple is not a building. It's a body of a building, a house of living stones. We are a temple. Apart from any physical stones, we are the temple, the place of God's earthly dwelling, right? The Lord always... what the Lord established was the tabernacle, right? He established the tabernacle, and he put the tabernacle in the midst of his people, and it was intentionally mobile, that God was going to move with his people, and that his people would be with him, that he would always be in the midst of his people. And it wasn't necessarily stationary. By God's design, it wasn't stationary. I mean, the ark was designed to have poles that were put in it, to move. That that the presence of God would be moving in the midst of his people, would be moving in the land. It was in man that said, let's build, and in the heart of David, from a good place to say, let's build a temple. Since I have a palace, you shouldn't live in a tent. And the Lord says, I love what's in your heart, but I never really asked for a temple. I never really asked for that. The Lord's purpose was always to be among his people, and he cannot be contained. And so he is not contained in a building, but he fills us as his people. And so Peter will soon begin to explain to these living stones that as they suffer, they are suffering not because of they're going to suffer as the living stone suffered, not because they're not chosen by God, but because they are chosen by God. To this you were called. To this you were invited. And the cornerstone, he's the living stone by virtue of his resurrection, which points to this hope that we have. That though we are dying, though we are suffering, that there is hope. We are living stones as he is a living stone. Verse 6, for it says in Scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a stone, a precious cornerstone. Whoever trusts in him will never be put to shame. I want to give you the overall passage of this. We're going to read from Isaiah chapter 28:16 to give the context of what the Lord was saying here. The Lord is speaking in advance of the destruction, of the judgment that's coming upon God's people, and much of what we went through in Isaiah, but this is 100 years earlier than in Jeremiah, what we went through in Jeremiah. So in context, when we read Isaiah 28, it says, Oi, verse 1, the proud of Ephraim's drunks. So who are Ephraim's drunks? We'll see in just a second. So Ephraim, speaking to the northern kingdom of Israel, its glorious beauty, it's a fading flower, which is the head of the fertile valleys, and those overcome with wine. Behold, Adonai is strong and mighty, like a hailstorm, a destructive tempest, like a downpour of overflowing water. He hurls it down to earth, and his hand. The proud crown of Ephraim's drunks will be trampled underfoot. The glorious beauty is a fading flower, which is at the head of a fertile valley, like a first ripe fig before summer. Whoever sees it swallows it up while it's still in his palm. In that day, Adonai Tzevaot, the Lord of hosts, will be a crown of glory, a diadem of beauty to the remnant of his people. A spirit of mishpat, of justice or judgment, justice for him who sits on the seat of justice, and strength for those turning back the battle at the gate, those who are fighting. The Lord will be a crown to those who are a remnant. Verse 7, what about these drunks, it says? It says, but these also reel from wine and stagger from strong drink. The priest and the prophet reel from strong drink. Now, this isn't necessarily alcohol. It's obviously a metaphor. They're confused. It can't include it, but they're confused because of wine, and they stagger of strong drink. They are muddled in vision. They stumble in judgment, since all the tables are full of filth and vomit. No place is left. So what you have here are the religious leadership in Isaiah 28. The priests, the prophets, or the drunks. They don't have a clarity of vision. They don't see. They're staggering. They're not using proper justice and judgment. And what the result is a stench in the place that is supposed to have a perfume of sacrifice, where there's the incense rising and you have the sacrifice going up. Instead, what you have is the vomit, what's left over because of their drunkenness and their staggering in their judgment and their vision. Verse 9, to whom To whom will the Lord then, since you don't have the priests and the prophets, look at them, they're all drunk on this. To whom will he teach knowledge? To whom will he explain the message? Those just weaned from milk. Those just taken from the breast. Now, the translation puts a question mark in here, and that's not necessarily the case. For it must be precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. For through stammering lips and a foreign tongue, he will speak to his people. To whom he said to his people, here is rest, give rest to the weary, here is repose. He invited them to rest, but they would not listen. So the word of Adonai is to them, precept on precept, precept on precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. So they walk, they fall backward, and are broken, trapped, and captured. Right? He's talking about these, speaking of the those that are not considered, those that are like children. They don't know. They don't have what the priests and the prophets have. And yet, to whom will he teach? He's going to teach them little by little, line upon line. And they're going to walk, and they're going to stagger, they fall back. But hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers, who rule this people who are in Jerusalem. Because you have said, we cut a covenant with death. We made a pact with Sheol. So when the overflowing scourge passes through, it won't come for us. For we have made lies our refuge and hid ourselves in falsehood. So you can see, by the way, all of how this is an underlying understanding in what Peter is saying when he's saying, rid yourselves of all falsehood. Like newborn babies. Don't be like those who are hidden and tucked away in a refuge of falsehood, who've lied to themselves, who've convinced themselves they're like drunk men in their religious leadership, in their understanding. Meanwhile, be like newborn babies, craving the pure spiritual milk, line upon line, precept upon precept. Verse 16, therefore thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a tested stone, like one that's come through the fire is the idea, one that has been a metal tested. It's come through the fire and it's been proven. A costly, a valuable cornerstone, a firm foundation, a foundational foundation is the idea. Whoever trusts will not flee in haste. But I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line. Right? It's going to come about how do we live out our love toward others, the way we treat people in mishpat and in tzedakah, in righteousness and in justice, in doing what is good and right. And hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and water will overflow the hiding place. Your covenant with death is annulled, and your pact with Sheol will not stand. An overflowing scourge will pass through, and you will be its trampling place. So you've got sort of this underlying understanding here. And so Peter's quoting this, and he says in verse 7, now the value, this is only valuable to those who continue trusting, who keep trusting. In the midst of the difficulty, hold on. The value of this is only for those who keep trusting. For those who don't trust, it says the stone which the builders rejected, this one has become the chief cornerstone. Again, that's what Peter referred to and what Yeshua, as he reiterated Yeshua's preaching. Verse 8, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble because they're disobeying the word. To this they were appointed, or it can mean they were given. They were given over to this. They were allowed. They were given to their disobedience, to the stubbornness of their own heart. That the Lord will bring every opportunity. He will give you opportunity. He will call and call and call. But if in our stubbornness, if we stand firm against everything that he reveals to us and we say no, then he will give us over to our disobedience of his word. Because he's not controlling. Again, the fruit of the Spirit is not other control, it's self-control. And the Lord himself isn't controlling us like on a puppet string. He invites us. He invites us to obey him. says they were appointed. And here he's quoting from Isaiah 9 or Isaiah 8, and I'm almost done, honestly. Isaiah 8 verses 9 through 17. It would make an uproar, O peoples, but you will be broken in pieces. Give ear, all of you far countries. Arm yourselves, yet be shattered. Arm yourselves, yet be shattered. Like you can't fight what the Lord's going to do. Take counsel together, but it will amount to nothing. Speak a word, but it will not stand. For Emmanuel, God is with us. Verse 11, for thus Adonai spoke to me with a strong hand, warning me that I should not walk in the way of these people, saying, and the Lord was saying, do not say it's a conspiracy about everything that these people call a conspiracy. You must not fear or tremble at what they fear. Verse 13, Adonai Tzevaot, the Lord of hosts, him you will sanctify. And let him be your fear, trembling at him. He will be a sanctuary, right? A holy, the mikdash, the tent, the dwelling place. He will be a sanctuary. But the picture given here says, but a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Right? To those who will not submit to his ways, though you are of the house, if there's a stumbling block here. There is that which if you don't walk in his ways, it will cause you to stumble. It says, many among them will stumble, fall, and be broken, snared, and caught. Bind up the testimony, seal the instruction with my disciples. I will wait for Adonai, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will look eagerly for him. So you've got what you continually have in the teachings of Yeshua and in the teachings of Paul and Peter. It's not set up as Jew against Gentile. It's set up, as it always has been, as those who believe and trust and walk in trust versus those who reject and don't trust the Lord and don't listen to the Lord and don't follow the Lord, and they set themselves up against the Lord. And it doesn't matter your bloodline. There is a remnant of those who continue to trust among the chosen, among God's people, and then among Israel, among Judah. And then grafted in are those who believe from all the families of the earth, from all the nations of the earth. And God is bringing those rejected by the elite, rejected by by men as not enough or not good enough. And God's taking them, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the throwaways. He's taking them, these stones, rejected, and saying, perfect. I'm building a holy place. It says, but you, verse 9, but you are a chosen people. You are a kingdom of priests, or a royal priesthood. You're a kingdom of priests. You are chosen. You are a kingdom of priests. You are a set-apart nation, a set-apart ethnos, holy, a holy ethnicity, right? It's not actually about your ethnicity. You've been made into a people. That's the point. That he is assembling a house of rejected stones. And now you are a people, a holy ethnos. Hold on, I moved. A people for God's own possession. A people who are preserved by him, his remnant. So that, in order that, you may proclaim, here it says the praises of the one, but it's bigger than that, the excellency. So that you may proclaim the majesty, the excellency of the one who called you out of darkness into the marvel of his light, into the wonder, the glory of his light. Right? And so even there you have passages that you flow back to Isaiah 42, 6 and 7. I, Adonai, called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations, by opening blind eyes, bringing prisoners out of the dungeon, and those sitting in darkness out of the prison house. Exodus 19, right before he gives the 10 commandments, right? It says, now then, if you listen closely to my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be my own treasure, my own possession from among all the people, for all the earth is mine. So as for you, you will be to me a kingdom of Kohanim, of priests, and a holy nation. These are the words which you are to speak to Bnei Israel, to the children of Israel. Peter continues here, quoting from Hosea, saying, once you were not a people, lo ami, but now you are God's people. You were shown, you were the ones without chesed, without mercy, but now you have received chesed, mercy. Right? So know who you are. God is assembling. Yeah, you feel like you're rejected, thrown away, but God is chosen, and he's using you, and he's put you where you are with purpose. And the implication is that part of that, as we declare the excellency of him who called us out of darkness and into his light, that we are declaring that to others who are rejected, who are thrown aside, because they'll have ears to hear, they'll have eyes to see, they'll have brokenness to receive and respond. That which is being built by men into glorious structures that men worship and praise, that's not what God's building. He's not building something that everyone will marvel. It will be obvious that people will marvel at. He's taking these rejected stones, starting with the rejected living stone. That's the cornerstone. That's a starting point. And from that, he's building a spiritual house with a kingdom of priests who are daily dying, who are loving one another by stretching out to the full, who are obeying the truth, who are craving after the reality of God's transformative power within me, that his love and his righteousness and his justice and the beauty of who he is would flow through us. That's our desire. Once we were not a people, just as Israel was not a people, now God is taking a remnants for all who will believe, for all who will keep trusting. The value is for those who keep trusting. For the value is for those. That's where you got to stay focused. Keep trusting him. When things begin to look differently than you'd expect, keep trusting him and know that he is building a house. And you and I, scattered, listen, all over the world, scattered all over this city, we are a spiritual house that the Lord is building, that we are called to offer up, to sacrifice, to slaughter spiritual sacrifices, spiritual offerings, that which brings life. And he is building something that may not look like anything on the surface to anybody else, but he's doing a new thing. I believe that he's doing a new thing in us, through us. And there are others all over this world that the Lord is uniting us with, that he is working as he purifies his people, if we'll have ears to hear what he's saying to us. That it's not to be a kingdom following a priest other than him as high priest. It's not to be a people that simply follow just where we just go to services and it's all about us receiving. We are a kingdom of priests. We are all supposed to be offering up the sacrifices. 100% of us, all of us in different ways, ministering in the place where he's put us. Chosen, that you're there, chosen and on purpose. And he knew you'd be there, not to receive, but to pour out. All right, I'm done. All right, well, I've gone long. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom, shalom. Have a beautiful day.